I was told that in the interest of time that I will not be going through everybody's bios. You have them, of course. I think there's some great papers that kind of speak for themselves. So the first person up is Aditi Sen, and then Kristen Underhill will follow.
Great. Well, thanks, Neil, and thanks to all of you for sticking around. I know we're the last thing standing between you and a beautiful Friday afternoon, so thanks for staying. I'm really pleased to be here to talk about this study, which looks at a question of whether financial incentives crowd out intrinsic motivation for weight loss. And this is joint work with David Huffman, who's at Oxford, George Lowenstein at Carnegie Mellon, Jeff Kulgren, who's at Michigan, and David Ash and Kevin Volpe, who are like me at Penn. So before I get into our study, I just want to provide a little bit of motivation. So as I'm sure many of you know, financial incentives have been used successfully to promote health behavior change in a number of different areas, from weight loss to smoking cessation to medication adherence. But what we've seen in a number of field experiments is that these incentives tend to have positive effects in the short run, but the effects sort of diminish over time. So here are a couple of examples. So on your left is a figure from a study of financial incentives for weight loss. And what you can see is that at month 8, the incentive arm participants, who are the little black squares, had lost a significant amount of weight compared to the control group, but at month 17, this effect had totally disappeared, and the incentive group was right back up to 0 weight loss, and so right back up to the control level. And on your right is a figure from another study. This is a study of gym attendance, and we see sort of a similar pattern here. So for the month when incentives were in place, there was a big spike in the number of people who had at least one gym visit, but then as soon as incentives were removed, performance sort of dropped right back down to the control levels. And so there's some concern that this decrease in performance that we've seen in a number of field experiments is due to the fact that by providing financial incentives to these participants, we're actually crowding out their own intrinsic motivation for whatever behavior change, whether it's weight loss or gym attendance. There are some challenges to measuring crowding out effects behaviorally. So this is another study, this area of work. This is also gym attendance. This is a study of financial incentives by Charnes and Nisi. And here what we see is a different result. So again, between the two lines, you see the effect while incentives were in place. And again, there's this big spike of people with gym visits. But then as soon as incentives are removed, performance does fall, but doesn't fall all the way. And we can see that it stays about twice the level of the control group. So there is some persistence, which may suggest crowding in, actually, or habit formation. So there are mixed results from these types of studies. And it's actually really difficult in this behavioral setting to look at what exactly is going on with financial incentives and intrinsic motivation. So what we're interested in doing in this study is testing directly the effect of financial incentives on intrinsic motivation by measuring motivation using survey measures. And we think that there are some advantages to this approach, primarily that, as I said, it's hard to know by looking at the behavioral outcomes exactly what's going on with intrinsic motivation. And we might think that maybe crowding out is happening, but it's happening, for instance, outside of the study window, so we're not capturing it. But by measuring intrinsic motivation directly, we would expect that the direct effects on motivation would happen pretty quickly, even while the incentive is in place, certainly right after. So we think this is a useful complement to existing work. So what do? We use repeated direct measurements of intrinsic motivation. And I'll tell you a little bit more about our setting in a second. But we take the test of motivation and incentives to the field setting, where we look at effects in sort of a real-world population of overweight adults who want to lose weight. And we also are able to study different incentive schemes, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second as well. But in some theories of intrinsic motivation, the sort of type and size of an incentive is seen as a signal of the intrinsic attractiveness of the task. And so, therefore, understanding sort of how intrinsic motivation looks across different incentive settings might be important. So let me tell you a bit more about our study. So we measure intrinsic motivation in the context of 2 field experiments. Both are workplace wellness programs where individuals are given financial rewards for losing weight. The first study is a 3-armed randomized control trial of group versus individual rewards for weight loss. And I'm not going to go into the details of each of these studies sort of in the interest of time, but I'm happy to say more about them, and there's more in the paper. And the second study is a 4-arm randomized control trial that looks at deposit contracts for weight loss with different levels of employer matching. So you have a no matching group, a 1-to-1 match, and a 2-to-1 match from the employer. And in both of these settings, we measure motivation using the treatment self-regulation questionnaire, which was developed in the psychology literature initially to assess reasons that individuals participate in academic or pro-social activities, but it's since been validated in a number of different health settings. And it essentially studies the reasons why people engage in a particular activity, for instance, losing weight in our case, or could be used to look at why people start and stick with a treatment regimen or a number of other behaviors. So essentially, this is a 15-item questionnaire where each item is a response to the STEM, the reason I would lose weight is. And so, for example, I've listed 2 of the items here. One is I want to take responsibility for my health. This is seen as an intrinsic reason. And another is I feel pressure from others to do so. This is an extrinsic factor. And for each of these 15 items, participants rate how true that factor is for them on a scale from 1, where it's not at all true, to 7, where it's very true. And then so for all of the intrinsic items, the scores are averaged, and you have an intrinsic motivation score ranging from 1 to 7. So we measure motivation using this TSRQ tool at baseline, at 6 months, and at 9 months. So 6 months is the end of the incentive period, and then 9 months is at the end of the 3-month follow-up period. And our analytic strategy is very simple. So basically what we're looking at is changes in intrinsic motivation over time in incentive arms versus control arms. And in particular, we want to see if there's a greater decline in intrinsic motivation over time in incentive arms compared to the control arm, which would suggest crowding out. We look at this in the aggregate population and also in 2 subpopulations of interest, those who had a baseline relatively higher baseline weight, and those who earned relatively more in financial incentives. So our first key finding is that baseline intrinsic motivation is very high. So as I said, intrinsic motivation ranges from 1 to 7, and you can see that in both studies and across nearly all of the arms, baseline intrinsic motivation is above 6. And this is not too surprising, right, since these are participants who have voluntarily enrolled in weight loss programs. But just to sort of calibrate the scale to know sort of where these participants place themselves, we know that they place themselves at the top of the scale. And so these 2 simple graphs show our main results. So what these graphs are showing is intrinsic motivation at baseline in the blue, at 6 months in the red, and at 9 months in the green, for study 1 on your left and study 2 on your right, by arm. So in each graph, the control arm is the one furthest to the left, and the incentive arms are to the right. And what you can see is that despite starting at the top of this scale, there's basically no changes in intrinsic motivation between incentive arms and control arms in either study. And so this suggests that there's no evidence of crowding out. We also don't see any evidence of crowding out when you look at, again, baseline 6-month and 9-month intrinsic motivation across baseline weight categories. So on the left, you'll see for study 1, intrinsic motivation over time for those who are below median baseline weight and compared to those above, and similarly for study 2. In study 1, you can see that there are no changes over time at all, either within an arm or across arms. In study 2, you will notice that there are decreases in intrinsic motivation in both groups, but as we saw earlier, it's not differential decreases in incentive versus control arms, and it's not differential decreases across these baseline weight categories either. So we also look at whether intrinsic motivation decreased or changed differentially for people who earned more from the financial incentives in these 2 studies. And so if we think that financial incentives are crowding out intrinsic motivation, we might think that people who earned relatively more are either more likely to experience crowd out or might experience more crowd out. But as you can see here again, what these graphs show is again the same baseline 6-month and 9-month intrinsic motivation, this time for people who earned below versus above median earnings in study 1 on the left, and those who earned positive and negative earnings in study 2 on the right. And again, there are no changes in intrinsic motivation in these two groups. So just to summarize, using this treatment self-regulation questionnaire, we have two main findings. First, we find that voluntary participants in these weight loss programs have very high levels of intrinsic motivation at baseline. And second, we find that despite plenty of room to fall in the scale, there's no drop in intrinsic motivation that would suggest crowding out by incentives. There's no change in incentive versus non-incentive arms, which is our main test, and there's no change among the two subpopulations that we looked at. So of course, what we think we've shown is that there's no evidence for crowding out in this setting, but what we haven't done is to lend any other insight into why we see that these effects of incentives diminish over time. And that's, of course, one of the many remaining questions when it comes to looking at long-run effects of financial incentives, and in particular, how these incentives interact with motivation. So in terms of these questions, you might think about the relationship between the size of incentive and crowding out. In general, why do incentives work in some cases and not in others? Are the effects of incentives different for good habits, such as going to the gym, versus stopping bad habits, such as smoking? And of course, arguably what we want to be doing in the health incentive setting is to create incentives that can be designed to promote crowding in or habit formation. And so that's lots of room for future research. So, thank you very much.
So next we have Kristen Underhill, which of course you know because we have a two-person panel.
Great. Thank you so much for staying until the bitter end of today. I will try to be short and sweet since I'm the only thing keeping you from dinner. So I'm going to talk about a research project that I did on motivational crowding out. My project was actually pitched at a more general level. So if you look at my paper, you'll see examples from really across the spectrum of law and policy. But I'll be focusing today on the examples that are most relevant to health law. So we've seen a number of different places, some of which were mentioned today, of areas where motivational crowding out is of some concern to health policymakers, health lawyers, people in this field. For example, one of the ones we just saw, does paying patients or employees to engage in healthy behaviors crowd out other motivations to engage in something healthy for a good reason? So motivations like self-care or a sense of duty, something like that. One that we see that's really been a lightning rod in health for a long time is whether paying organ donors might crowd out altruistic motivations to donate organs, to donate blood. And there was a famous debate about this in the 1970s with Richard Titmuss and Kenneth Arrow. Next, there have been some new questions that have arisen in recent years about whether paying physicians based on their performance or their outcomes might actually crowd out other motivations, intrinsic motivations, to care for patients in a high-quality way. Things like professional norms or a sense of duty towards patients or fiduciary duty. And finally, one that we've seen in some other areas, there are a few countries that are ahead of us in the use of conditional cash transfer programs, but these are programs that pay people to receive vaccinations, to attend school, to do other types of health-promoting behaviors, similar to the incentive program we learned about this morning for the vaccination program in India. So for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how motivational crowding out works. I'll introduce some different categories of motivation, look at the ways that incentives might have dual effects on people's behaviors, depending on their desire for the incentive and the way the incentive interacts with their intrinsic motivation. And one of the things that I'm hoping to convince you of is that motivational crowding out is an extremely heterogeneous phenomenon. There are, in my review of the literature, I identified at least 9 different mechanisms that are empirically supported to lead to motivational crowding out effects. And these also have a range of different effects that can be measured by behavior, by effects on autonomy, and the potential even for moral and attitudinal effects. So I'll be telling you a little bit about that. I've tried to design a framework to govern when and why regulators should get involved, to police incentive programs, to intervene in them, and to potentially look at some ways that they could be redesigned. And finally, I'll speak a little bit about incentive architecture options. So those are ways to modify incentive programs to hopefully alleviate motivational crowding out effects. And I call it incentive architecture, not choice architecture, because incentives are actually very different. Instead of just reordering choices or trying to encourage a selection from among a bunch of options, incentives actually materially change the choice set and attach new penalties or new rewards to behaviors that previously were considered on their own. So there are 3 basic categories of motivation that you'll see throughout the literature on crowding out. One is intrinsic motivation, and those are behaviors such as motivations such as enjoyment, reciprocity, doing something for the sake of the thing itself, altruism, self-care, curiosity, morality, the avoidance of guilt, spite. All of these are considered to be intrinsic motivations. And we tend to see a bias in the literature towards praising behaviors that are intrinsically driven compared to those that are externally driven. So extrinsic motivation is the desire to get some kind of separable gain other than just the joy of doing the behavior itself. So this could be the desire for a financial reward, the desire for status. A lot of people will class reputational motivations with extrinsic motivations because it's a desire for social standing or social capital or esteem, which can then be cashed in for rewards such as, if you're running for office or if there's things that social capital and good reputation can get you. But I like to consider reputational motivation separate because it also encompasses our desire to think well of ourselves and to really have a positive self-image is in the reputational category as well. So those are the 3 categories of motivation. So when you impose an incentive on a particular behavior, you can expect it to have several different impacts. And throughout this portion of the talk, I'll be talking about principals as the people who impose incentives. So maybe a government, an employer, a parent incentivizing her child. Anyone that sets the terms is the incentive architect or the principal. And the person doing the behavior, I'll be calling them the agent. And then whoever is benefiting from the behavior will be the beneficiary, which can be either the principal or the agent or a third party. So when you impose an incentive on a behavior, when the incentive works the way it's supposed to and increases the levels of the behavior, that's known as the disciplining effect or the relative price effect. And that's where an incentive leads to more of what you want. But there's also this wild card effect, which is the way the incentive interacts with pre-existing intrinsic motivations. And there's 3 ways that this can go. For a long time, it was believed, and this is kind of standard economic, kind of classical economic idea, that when you add an extrinsic incentive, it really just builds on your motivations that you already had. So we're going to add up together your intrinsic motivation plus your new extrinsic motivation, and then you'll be really motivated to do whatever it is the principal wants you to do. But starting in the 1960s and 70s, research in a variety of fields found that this may not be true. So some of this research has led to theories of motivational crowding out, which is the idea that an extrinsic incentive can interfere with your intrinsic motivations in one of 2 ways. It can either lead to an absolute reduction in the level of your intrinsic behaviors, so you end up with less intrinsic motivation than you did before. Or it can lead to a relative reduction of intrinsic motivation, which is the idea that while you were previously doing something for the dominant reason that you just wanted to do it, or you were altruistic, or you cared about your health, now the dominant reason for doing it is going to be getting that intrinsic incentive. And that can change behavior patterns in a number of ways. So those are two forms of motivational crowding out. And I'm actually introducing this absolute and relative distinction for the first time in this paper. So hopefully it will be helpful. And then there's the idea of motivational crowding in, which is the suggestion that when you impose an incentive, it actually increases your intrinsic motivation to do something. Perhaps you feel empowered by the incentive, or there could be a variety of other mechanisms there that I won't really be going into. But motivational crowding out has been seen to be pernicious because it can cause incentive programs to backfire, either at the time when they're taking place or subsequent to the incentive program when it's been removed. Maybe you'll see worse behavior than you ever did before. So motivational crowding out can happen in at least 9 ways, as I was mentioning, and each one of these ways has support in the literature. I won't go through all 9, but I'll go through just a few to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. The big one that is frequently mentioned is the idea of overjustification or impaired self-determination, where an incentive changes the locus of control of your behavior from an internal motivation to an external motivation. And this change of your locus of control can be offensive. People can rebel against that, and it leads you to feel less empowered and less likely to engage in the behavior. The next way is that the incentive can actually serve as a signal from the principal to the agent about a variety of different parameters. One of those parameters, as Aditi just mentioned, is task value. A high incentive, for example, could show that the task is really burdensome, or it's really dangerous, or it has a lot of risks. But a high value could also show that the task is really important to the principal. So that can kind of go both ways. An incentive can also show that the agent is potentially not trustworthy to the principal. If I don't trust you to do something, maybe I'm going to pay you more to try to get you to do it, or the other way around. So a lot of these are places where the incentive can cut both ways. In some settings, an incentive can give the impression that the principal is hostile, such as areas where there's a perceived implicit contract or a social contract where the agent's going to do good things for the principal anyway. So then a principal attempting to control the agent's actions by incentives can be perceived as evidence that the principal has little faith or really isn't worth this kind of a social commitment. Or an incentive can show, for example, that social norms aren't good enough to support the activity the way it is. So if I have to pay people to lose weight, maybe that means that there's not enough pressure in the world already to get them to lose weight. And this is probably not as applicable to weight loss as it is to other behaviors. But that's one example of how it could work. 2 more mechanisms I'll tell you about have to do with reputational effects. One of them is image spoiling, and the other is self-image spoiling, which is the idea that you lose your opportunity to signal to other people that you are altruistic, or signal to yourself that you are altruistic when you're getting paid to do something. So I see my yellow light coming on here, so I'm gonna try to go quickly through the rest of this. Incentives that cause motivational crowding out arouse concern on a few different bases. One of them is the concern for autonomy. If you're messing with someone's intrinsic motivation, is that evidence that you're impairing their autonomy, or is it itself your impairment of their autonomy? So that's an interesting question, kind of a semantic distinction, but the idea that an incentive can be unduly coercive or even disabling if it's too high. Behavioral impacts are another one, and there's a few different categories here. If your motivation has been absolutely depressed, it can lead to less engagement now, less engagement in the future, reduced quality of your performance, but the potential for a changed distribution in the agents that are willing to do a behavior. And we see this a lot in the organ donation context, where people worry that if you start paying, it's going to attract less desirable donors, or maybe donors who have an incentive to hide their medical history so that they'll be able to get this payment. And it will really change the distribution of burdens and benefits of donating. And there's also issues with the relative reduction of motivation. If you're so distracted by trying to get this reward, maybe you won't put in as high quality a performance as you otherwise would. So there's some good questions there, and there's a number of scholars, including Michael Sandel here at Harvard, who talk about crowding out as a moral harm, that when you interfere with motivations, you're really destroying part of the social fabric. So I've also identified a few different benefits of motivational crowding out. And one of them that I think is fairly novel is the idea of ignoble motivations, and that when you reduce the scope for the operation of intrinsic motivations, maybe you're also reducing the opportunities for people's implicit biases to influence their work. In my paper, I apply this to the potential for biased, or for the operation of implicit bias in physician prescription. Finally, there's a few different reasons why we might want to get involved and why the market might not fix incentives on its own. And we're really biased to believe that other people will respond to incentives, even if we think that what we're doing is because we're intrinsically motivated. So looking at why the market might not fix this itself gives us a good reason to think about regulation. So I have a framework here, and with my last minute, I'll just tell you a little bit about it. There's different justifications for intervening to stop motivational crowding out effects depending on who the principal is and who the beneficiary of the action is. And basically, you can see here that whenever the agent and the principal are different, I believe there are some autonomy reasons to think about looking at crowding out effects and seeing if they're having an effect on motivation and whether they are unduly coercive or if they're so high as to be somewhat disabling. And then there's also behavioral impacts. And I think that when the government is the principal, there's good reason to get involved in order to make that incentive more efficient and to avoid the behavioral impacts of crowding out that could undermine the effects of incentive programs either now or in the future. But I don't think that that's a reasonable basis for intervention when the principal is private or when the agent incentivizes him or herself, such as the use of a commitment contract. And I think that's because the private principal or the agent in those scenarios has the opportunity to modify the incentive, and that if autonomy is respected, then we should be okay with the outcomes of the incentive programs. And finally, when there's a third party benefiting from the incentive, that's when we have externalities as a result of motivational crowding out. And I think those may be, in some cases, the strongest, and in some cases, the only justification for intervening in a crowding out effect. So that's most of what I wanted to tell you. The last part of my paper and the last part that I was planning to mention was that the remedy that you select for a crowding out effect really depends on the mechanism that's happening. And there's ways that intervening in crowding out could be productive for some mechanisms, but really counterproductive for other ones. And I'm happy to talk about that more in questions. So I'll leave you with the one conclusion I really want to leave you with is that mechanisms matter when we're looking at remedying and evaluating crowding out effects, and that there could be justifications for intervention, but not all the time. And I'll leave you with a picture of a crowd, one of the more attractive crowds I could find in open access pictures, and I welcome your questions and comments. Thank you.
All right, so we've got a relatively small two-person panel and a huge topic to unpack. Really, for all of us, I think, who've ever had to manage people or a system of any kind and put incentives in place, this gives us, incentives often don't work out the way we plan. And so this gives us a way of starting to think about why that might be. So maybe as we sort of wait for people to line up for questions, I'll throw out the first one. So what we've got is one specific example with an empirical study, a very, very high-yield example. I'm a physician myself, and I don't think there's a type of physician out there that doesn't have to deal with, in some way, or at least wanting their patients to lose weight. Obviously, a really hard thing to do. And we see motivational crowd out in so many other settings. Sort of curious that we didn't see it in this specific setting. Then also, on the other hand, we have this great framework for starting to think about why we see motivational crowd out in the first place and how we might think about regulation in that context. So I was hoping both of you might kind of respond to why we think in the case of the very specific case of where we have really highly motivated, intrinsically highly motivated people at baseline, why we don't see this crowd out effect.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think you sort of highlighted what was going to be part of my answer, which is that I think in a lot of cases where crowding out has been documented before, we probably would expect that those people would not have had as high intrinsic motivation at baseline as our participants had. So a lot of the evidence from crowding out so far, which I think Kristen can speak to even better, shows that it has been developed in the psychology literature or having to do with sort of pro-social motivations. And those are both just very different contexts than personal health, where we would expect that people would have very high baseline motivation. And so I think that that the fact that our participants were voluntary, that they enrolled in a weight loss program, and that they had such high baseline motivation sort of suggests that so the reasons why we didn't see any crowding out in this case.
Oh yeah, and I will just echo that. I think Aditi's group has done some really wonderful work in looking at the variety of motivations that people might have to engage in weight loss behavior, and I think that there's room here for many incentive programs to work in different ways and in different populations. And so exposing that heterogeneity and looking at that in future studies, I think is going to be really important. I do think that that type of program where an insurer or an employer is running that kind of, or a physician's practice is running that kind of program to incentivize health behaviors, that would fall under the lowest level of concern for me. I think so long as autonomy is satisfied, I think we would need to respect the motivations that people are expressing, and respect their autonomy to make the decisions whether or not it's in the presence of an incentive. So I think that those types of programs would really not draw too much concern from me.
Great. Yeah, David Orentlicker from Indiana University. Your model for, I'd be curious about hearing more about your model for good, when we have to worry about crowding out. And so I want to give you an example to flesh out your model, and that's the tax incentives for charitable deductions. It's something we accept, and that doesn't seem to be questioned. We don't worry about people have lost their willingness to make charitable contributions. Does this reinforce your model? Where does this fall?
So in my model, this would be this would be a governmental principle with a third-party beneficiary. So this would be the kind of place where we would want to look at whether the incentive is so great as to be perceived as coercive or as to be unduly influential in the donor's decision. And I think with the type of people that are donating to charity, I think we have a fair assumption that this is a sophisticated group. And I think also we usually only worry a lot about inducement and coercion when the action that's being required or the action that's at stake in the incentive poses some kind of risk. So you'll see this much more in concern about paying research subjects or paying people to undergo certain types of treatments. So I think I should also explain that in my model, I'm very much against the precautionary principle I'm very much in favor of the precautionary principle, where we should not go in to break up these programs or to intervene or to redesign them unless there is hard evidence that autonomy is going to be a concern or there is a behavioral backfiring effect. Whether in the various types of effects that motivational crowding out can cause. So I think for that precise example, that's where it would be on my model, where it would be justifiable to intervene based on harms to third parties if charitable donations went way down or below the level where they were before the incentive was introduced. That would be cause for redesign. And the efficiency of the program of the tax deductions would also be at issue there. But I think with that particular program, we can be satisfied on autonomy concerns and the behavioral effects so far. Thanks.
I had a question about the idea of coercion that I think has come up on almost every panel, and I feel like as a bioethicist, this is probably the weakest link in rigorous thinking about bioethical problems, is this term coercion that I'm not sure has that's empirically been shown to be used very loosely by both scholars and practitioners in the bioethics field. And it comes up, I think, most prominently in the field of human subjects research because we have such a regulatory apparatus around human subjects research that we don't have about, say, nudging gym memberships, right? We might, if we nudge them for research purposes, but out in the wild world, the concerns about coercion don't come up in the same way. So I wonder if, since you use the term coercion, if you have an operationalized definition that means something other than just very influential in a way we don't like, or if maybe we should instead return to using coercion to apply to threats and things like that that leave someone worse off compared to their baseline rather than an offer of benefits.
I think that's a great point. I agree. I don't actually have an operationalized definition of coercion at the moment. From what I can tell, I don't think the Supreme Court does either in their recent Medicaid jurisprudence. But I think we should leave open the option that incentives can be so high that no rational person in the agent's position would forego them, or a penalty that's so high that no one in the agent's position would be willing to incur it. And I think that where that happens, I think that there should be some operationalized definition of it. I don't have it at the moment. One of the things that I'm interested in terms of personal health programs and incentivizing personal health is whether it might cause people to remain in treatments or to undergo treatments or to engage in behaviors that may be against their interest eventually. So if they're being incentivized to adhere to a medication regimen, are they going to stay on it for the incentives even past the point where the medication would be providing value to them? And that would be the kind of area where I can see a role for something akin to coercion, but maybe that's not the best term for it. And I'm open to thinking about that more.
I'm Ning Liu from Erasmus University Rotterdam. My question is to Aditi. It's about your project of motivation for weight loss, and I'm aware of also other projects to showing that how difficult it is to really decrease to motivate people to get weight loss. So it's definitely a marvelous project. I'm very interested. And I have a question, rather, it's about your measurement of their intrinsic motivation. And I noticed that it's a self-reported measure, and I'm not going to become the economics who brag about real incentive everywhere. But my concern is rather, I have confidence in it to differentiate people with different level of intrinsic motivation. But my question is rather how sensitive it is to measure the change of people's intrinsic motivation, because people need to be aware of that they become less motivated to be able to report it. So this is my question. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the reason that we used this particular scale is that it sort of is the scale that's been used in the psychology literature to for a lot of the original evidence on crowding out, and it hasn't really been used in this type of in health incentives field experiment before, and so we were interested in sort of using a validated survey tool. But I think you're absolutely right that it's very hard to measure something like motivation. You can measure it behaviorally, which is how a lot of the work has been done, where we see just performance fall below a baseline performance, and that might suggest crowding out. Other studies have, for instance, Kristen mentioned you might think about enjoyment of an activity as a measure of intrinsic motivation, which you may not have to be so aware of it. You just you enjoy it more before and you enjoy it later less, and most people can sort of have a way of expressing, oh, I enjoy an activity or I don't. And some studies have used that measure. So there hasn't really been enough work in this field yet to sort of say which measure is better or worse. And the way that the questionnaire we used is designed is it has these responses where there are things that people could feel. So that maybe they feel more pressure from other people after experiencing incentives, or they feel like less responsibility for their health. And some of these things are, the survey is designed with the expectation that people will be able to think about each of these items and sort of measure how they are feeling about it at different points in time. But you're right, and I think there's a lot of work to be done to think about how to actually measure motivation in these settings.
Hi, Moti Gorin, University of Pennsylvania. So my question is right on top of what this last question, which is, I think perhaps in the domain of weight loss or other behaviors that have a sort of moral valence for a lot of people, it's not just that it could be difficult to measure one's reduction or increase in intrinsic motivation, but there's reasons why somebody might not be sort of able or willing to cop, right, essentially, to no longer being as motivated intrinsically as they were. Sort of obesity has become sort of moralized in a way, and it's understandable that somebody wouldn't just say, well, you know what, frankly, I just don't care anymore about my health. Who cares if I lose weight? It's sort of unlikely that they would be willing to cop to that. And so I was going to ask a question about the survey, what kind of questions you asked, and how you might be able to elicit responses that there's sort of psychological pressures to not reveal. With respect to weight loss, smoking, other sort of behaviors that have been moralized in our health talk. Thanks.
Yeah, no, again, I mean, I think it's a really good question. And, since this was sort of the first use of this tool in the field, we were very interested in using a tool that has been well validated and established and used for a lot of the, to set up a lot of the previous evidence of crowding out in the psychology literature. And so that's why we used it. But I think, all these concerns are absolutely right. And I think it will be really helpful to think about other ways of measuring or eliciting questions that would sort of help us to get a better sense of, are people feeling external pressure, internal motivation, and to sort of look at how we can measure it differently.
Hi, Robin Pierce with Petrie-Flom, and thank you for your very interesting work. My question has to do with whether or not risk is the only concern. It seems to me that with regard to financial incentives, there's also a concern about the disparate impact, that poor people are obviously more susceptible. And so I notice in your work, if I recall correctly, there was no stratification. And so I'm wondering if the effect, the crowding out effect, varies according to socioeconomic status.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that I'm really interested in. And unfortunately, in this study, we just don't have the sample size to be able to, look at effects differently across different demographic groups. What we're starting to do, actually, in some related work, is to just look at, do people respond to incentives differently? And we do see these types of effects that you're saying, where people who are poorer or less educated, respond in different ways to incentive programs than people who are, wealthier or have more education. And so I think you're right. There's potentially a lot of heterogeneity in these results, and we haven't been able to look at it in this study. But I think it's a really interesting area for future research.
We have a minute. Maybe just to follow up, did you have a chance to study, because really you're looking at the possible effect of crowding out over a dynamic process where people are gaining weight or losing weight in real time. And, we were talking earlier and talking about how often, as a clinician, when we think about intrinsic motivation, there seems to be, it seems to be very important how proximate the action and consequences. So you would think, somebody who's losing a lot of weight would stay really motivated, and someone who's not would not only be unmotivated, but like the exact opposite would happen. They'd get completely deflated. And did you have an opportunity to look at that?
Yeah, so again, unfortunately, it's the same issue where we just don't have the sample size to, be powered to look at these types of subgroups. And so we did look at it, but we didn't find any differences. And I don't think it's not a real result. The problem is our sample size in this case. And a lot of what a lot of studies have done that have used this survey tool before is to look at, does baseline intrinsic motivation predict your success in the program? And because we have such a little variation, so many of our people are very highly motivated, we don't find any effect in that domain. But unfortunately, we can't look at, do people who are more or less successful in the program have different effects? But I think it's really interesting.
Great. Well, I think it might be time for the next thing, dinner.